the High Priestess. Emily sat before the fortune teller, wondering why she was here. She should be outside within the traveling folks' camp, building relationships with the Lamonti and earning their trust. They would hardly give the answer she sought to a stranger. Emily had been researching the Lamonti's culture for a long time and the unusual phenomena that followed their camp for even longer. She was an anthropologist, a scientist, and didn't believe in magic. However, she had always been fascinated by the process by which the stories people told to explain what they didn't understand became accepted as truth in folklore and myth. Emily's interest in the Lamonti had started indirectly. She'd been visiting the rather remote village of Alvia, gathering folktales for her doctoral thesis, in which she intended to show examples and evidence of the events from which they might have been born. The Lamonti set up camp near Alvia, and Emily had been surprised and intrigued by the level of excitement tinged with fear in the village. She'd asked what was going on and what had caused such excitement. No one would tell her, saying only that they rarely had outsiders in town, and Lamonti always put on a little bit of fair when they stopped by. Emily had not gone to the fair, at least not then. While her mother tolerated her excursions to remote villages in search of folk tales, she had known that she would never have heard the end of it if her mother found out she had visited a gypsy camp, as her mother would have called it. Well-bred, respectable young ladies simply did not do such things, nor correct their mother's use of an insulting slur. Emily came to regret that decision within 2 weeks. Mrs. Calisand, one of her primary sources for the oldest tales, had been dying of a rare form of stomach cancer. The local doctor could do nothing, but felt that if Mrs. Calisand went to the capital city of Everton, there were specialists who might be able to remove or treat it. The old widow had refused, saying she wasn't going to waste what little money she had on a lost cause. The other villagers told Emily that every extra penny Mrs. Calisand earned with her hand-knit stockings, shawls, and hand-spun yarn went to fund her granddaughter's education at a prestigious school for engineers. Miss Calisand's parents did not support her education at all, believing it was not a proper choice of a career for a woman, and that she was putting on airs. Emily had met the young lady in question, detected nothing of the sort. Miss Calisand had come home during a school holiday the week the Lamonti had visited, and had seemed caring and attentive to her grandmother's needs. She was intelligent, but also practical and down to earth. She had ink and oil stains on the majority of her clothes, or majority of her dresses, and told Emily that her dream was to modernize Alvia, stating, "The modern world holds such wonders, and I want everyone here to have a chance to experience them." Miss Calisand's only flaw seemed to be that she had no patience for her grandmother's stories, calling them fairy tales and nonsense. Emily, while grateful in some ways, as it meant that Miss Calisand was eager for someone to record the tales so they would not be lost, was also disappointed that Miss Calisand could not see how her dismissive attitude hurt her grandmother's heart. Those tales were a large part of Miss Calisand's hard-earned wisdom, and by dismissing them, Miss Calisand was dismissing the life's knowledge that her grandmother wished to inherit. In the weeks after the fair, Mrs. Calisand's health, which had been rapidly deteriorating, began to steadily improve. Emily wondered at the change, but credited to having had the opportunity to visit with her granddaughter. As Emily would find out, that was only partially correct. During an afternoon tea, Mrs. Calisand apologized and stated she'd forgotten to take her medicine. She stood and retrieved a bottle from the cupboard. It had no label, but Emily could tell from the odd symbols etched in the glass that it had not come from the doctor. Emily had tentatively inquired where it had come from. Mrs. Calisand had positively beamed and told Emily that her granddaughter had obtained it from the Lamonti. Mrs. Calisand, however, would say no more on the subject. When Emily was returned to Everton, she had been unable to forget Mrs. Calisand's miraculous cure, and it was a cure. Just before Emily left, the doctor had told Mrs. Calisand the cancer was gone. She found herself spending time better spent on historical research for her thesis, looking up every reference to the Lamonti she could find. She found more than she expected. Scattered through various histories, she found references to the odd occurrences that happened after the Lamonti had been in an area. Mostly it was mentioned in passing. For example, one article read, "Shortly after the annual fair held by the Lamonti, the missing girl turned up unharmed, claiming she'd been kidnapped by fairies." They weren't all about miracles, though. A man had spontaneously combusted after forcing a kiss on a woman in the town square of Dabin, just north of Everton. All that had been left was a small vial etched with strange symbols. Looking at the artist's rendering in Dabin's newspaper, Emily had realized that she recognized a few of them from Mrs. Calisand's bottle. Shortly after Emily had successfully defended her doctoral thesis, she made a major breakthrough. Dr. Alexander, colleague 10 years deceased, had made an in-depth study of the Lamonti's culture. He maintained they were not simply another clan of traveling folk, that there was something different about them. Dr. Alexander had spent a great deal of time living with them, and stated that their culture revolved around a secret religion, and that their leader was someone they called the High Priestess of Monte. Dr. Alexander theorized that Monte was a goddess of a lost civilization, but had not been able to get definitive answers or even find out who the priestess was. Emily was determined to find those answers. Over her mother's objections that it was unseemly for an unmarried woman to live alone, she had set up her own household. She had known her mother would disown her when she found out Emily's plans. Fortunately, the collection of folk tales she had written based on Mrs. Calisand's stories was quite popular. Even considering that she sent half the royalties to Mrs. Calisand's way, she had more than enough to support herself for years to come. Thus, Emily was free to steer her own course. Emily was brought back to the present by the sound of a deck of cards being shuffled. A mysterious woman, who was a great deal younger than Emily had expected of a fortune-teller, calling herself Madame Zirolava, the All-Knowing, smiled at her across the table. There was a hint of mischief in this smile, and as if she knew Emily's thoughts had been wandering. "Tell me, Dr. Benson, what brings you to my table?" The question was innocent enough, but Emily couldn't escape the feeling that the woman already knew the answer to her question. That was rather a trick, as Emily wasn't quite sure herself. To be completely honest, I don't know. I came for the fair and I saw your sign. I suppose I must have wanted to see exactly what knowledge you offer to those who cross your threshold. The woman's smile grew even larger. Not quite the whole truth, but honest enough. You've come seeking answers. The fortune-teller, who Emily couldn't seem to think of as Madame Zirolova, ran a gloved hand over the crystal ball sitting in the center of the table. For a moment, Emily saw images within its cloudy interior. A man bursting into flame, a little girl running to an only slightly older boy. Miss Calisand, with her least ink and oiled-stained dress on. And was that Emily's father? It appeared to be a younger version of him, younger than he'd been in any picture of him that Emily had ever seen. However, he was clothed as a Lamonti, and the pin on the lapel of his leather jacket bore their crest, a stylized infinity symbol surrounding a similarly stylized feather. The fortune-teller returned to shuffling her cards, still smiling. "The problem, my dear, is that the answers you seek do not exist. At least, not in a way you would believe if I simply told them to you. They require life lessons and knowledge that can not be learned by reading a book or attending a lecture." She paused and dealt 5 cards down on the table. Making a horseshoe shape around the crystal ball, or perhaps it was meant to mimic the crescent moon, like the two that framed the full moon on the crystal ball's stand. The fortune-teller was still smiling, but her expression no longer had an air of amusement to it. The smile seemed almost forced. "If you truly wish to understand, turn the cards over one at a time. I warn you, however, not all knowledge is pleasant, and once gained, it can never truly leave you. Emily nodded her understanding, wondering how mere cards could hold the explanation she sought. Though she wasn't sure why, she took the woman's warning seriously. She didn't believe there was anything but superstitious hokum in her own mind playing tricks on her. Did she? Emily realized that the stories she had read of the odd occurrences that followed the Lamanti sown a seed of doubt in her conviction that stories of the supernatural were simply human attempts to explain as not yet understood scientific phenomena. She had to know. She turned over the card closest to her first, and was disappointed to find it blank. The woman's smile no longer seemed quite as forced, and her tone was kind as she spoke. That is an answer you are not ready for, my dear. Perhaps, before you leave my tent, you will be. She gestured toward the remaining cards. Emily considered the card on the far left, the one that lay closest to the darker of the two gear-covered pillars. She'd no sooner flipped the card, she found herself somewhere else. After a short moment of disorientation, Emily realized she was someone else as well. She was sitting on the other side of the fortune-telling table, facing a young man who might have been handsome if Emily could not feel the malice, anger, and contempt pouring off of him. She realized he was speaking about the same time she recognized him as the young man who had been the victim of spontaneous combustion. Please, Madame Zerolova, I love her. I need to know how to make her mine. Emily felt herself speak. You wish to possess her. That is not love. She must come to you of her own free will or not at all. The young man snarled at this answer. I will have her, with your help or without. If it's without, I will simply have to make sure your body's never found. Instead of fear, Emily felt a strange sense of resignation. She sighed as she pushed a button located underneath the table. A small boy, 8 or 9 years old, entered the tent a few moments later. Before the young man could object to the intrusion, Emily heard herself say, Toby, I need you to fetch a file from your father. The boy nodded and ran off to get the requested item. After he left, Emily once again had the strange sensation of speaking words that were not her own. Since you are so intent, I will offer you some small measure of assistance. I will provide you with a vial of distilled desire. Drink it. Then kiss the woman you desire so intently, and she will be with you for the rest of your life. Emily knew what the young man didn't, that the statement was only true because he would not live long enough for the woman to run away. Toby returned, and Emily took the vial and shooed him out of the tent. The symbols Emily had recognized as being the same on Mrs. Calasan's medicine bottle in the newspaper's illustration were there, but the rest were missing. Emily felt a rush of disgust as she reached out and touched the young man's forehead with her gloved hand, holding the vial in the other. To touch him was to reach into the aura of darkness that surrounded him, oily and foul. She forced herself not to flinch as she pulled from the energy of the obsession with his obsession with the woman he so desired to possess. She allowed it to flow through her into the vial which she knew was enchanted to convert the emotional energy into a physical form. As it filled with a vile-looking red liquid, the missing symbols flashed into existence. When it was full, Emily placed the stopper in the neck of the bottle and handed it to the young man. Take this, and never darken my door again. Emily's vision darkened for a moment, and when it returned, she was once again facing the fortune-teller. The card she had flipped was covered in strange symbols, and Emily knew what they meant somehow, but could not have expressed it in words if she had tried. The fortune-teller was smiling at her, although her eyes had a sad note. As I said, not all knowledge is pleasant. Continue your quest for understanding if you wish, but remember, You are free to leave at any time. Emily frowned. She didn't understand what had just happened. There was no logical explanation, and she knew none of her colleagues would take her seriously if she attempted to write a paper describing the experience. There was nothing practically gained by continuing. However, curiosity had always been her weakness. Emily found herself flipping the card nearest the white pillar in hopes that the experience would not be as dark. This time, Emily could perceive something in the split second when she flipped the card and the moment she became someone else. It was almost as though there was another person in the tent, but it was more than that. Emily didn't have long to ponder what exactly she had sensed. She found herself sitting across the table from another young man. This one only 12 or maybe 13. Despair and guilt rolled off of him in waves. I need to know how to find the fairies. There are a great many fairylands, and while this age of progress has led to many of those realms becoming inaccessible, there are more that hide in plain sight. Which do you seek? Although Emily's tone was calm, she was worried. She knew that fairies could be extremely difficult, and if this boy had said the wrong words or made the wrong promise, it was possible his sister could not be retrieved. I don't know, he cried. I should have listened to Abigail more closely, but I thought she was making up stories and imaginary friends. The boy's feelings of guilt intensified. You've never spoken with one? Or even seen one? The boy seemed truthful, but his sense of guilt was too deep for that to be its only cause. No, I wish I had. Then I wouldn't have gotten so mad at Abigail when she refused to come with me to the aeronautics display. Emily raised an eyebrow and gestured for him to continue. He did so, but he whispered as if saying the words aloud somehow made it worse. You see, Mother said I could only go if I took Abigail with me. She insisted that I needed to come to the park she and Mother go to in the afternoon when I'm still at school, and Abigail is finished for the day. She insisted I needed to meet her friends. I was so angry, and I told her she needed to grow up, that she was too old for imaginary friends. I tried to drag her with me, but she pulled free and ran towards the park. She made it in, and I could see her enter the gate, but even running as fast as I could, she was gone by the time I got there. Emily felt a great sense of relief. The boy, at least, had not done anything irrevocable. What would you give up to get your sister back? It was unlikely that any of the Fae would give up something they now considered theirs without some sort of payment, especially considering the insult the boy had given. The boy considered for a moment, and Emily could feel his despair war with a new hope. She also felt a sense of satisfaction that the boy didn't answer immediately. It showed he was taking the question seriously, that he intended to actually pay the cost, and was carefully weighing what he could truly afford to give. After a moment, he answered, I will pay any price that's within my power as long as the cost is only to me, not to my parents, my sister, or anyone else. Emily felt a rush of something like pride. The boy had a deep sense of honor and was clever enough to realize that some limitations were wise when offering to pay almost anything, especially when dealing with the Fae. She nodded. Then I will contact the lord of the nearest hill. If your sister is not with his court, he likely knows who has her. She pushed the button underneath the table, and a young girl came into the tent. Lucy, please retrieve my scrying bowl. The girl ran off, and Emily once again turned to the boy. Now, Leonard, comes the dangerous part. She felt rather than saw his bewilderment at the use of his given name, which he had not shared. Say the wrong words, and Abigail will be forever lost to you, aside from whatever cost Lord Edithrion chooses to impose on you for your further misstep. Leonard nodded. His trepidation and determination were equally strong as he asked, What should I say? Emily watched Leonard closely as she stated, For the most part, I would recommend taking your cues from me and treat him as you would a peer of the realm, a duke perhaps. You will have to apologize, of course. She was pleased to note that her last recommendation was met with confusion, not anger. Leonard asked, I know I need to apologize to Abigail, but why to the ones who took her away? Emily clarified. You denied the existence of the entire race, thereby declaring them to be less than nothing. You also refused an invitation to meet with them, an honor offered to very few mortals. The boy's eyes widened and his sense of guilt increased. Then this really is all my fault. Emily raised an eyebrow, but he said nothing more. She waited as he visibly collected himself, steeling his resolve. If I created this mess, it's my responsibility to fix the problem I created and put things back where they should be. Emily smiled. Indeed, but I will do my best to guide you. You did not but what most young men your age would have done. Your determination to undo your mistake does you credit. At that moment, Lucy returned with a large bowl made out of the same crystal as the ball on the table. She set it on the stand in the center of the table as Emily removed the aforementioned crystal ball and placed it inside the bowl. Lucy then brought a pitcher of water, and Emily carefully poured it into the bowl, half submerging the crystalline sphere. Next, she lit 5 white candles and 5 incense sticks, alternating them as she placed them around the edge of the table. Emily asked, "Are you prepared to do what must be done?" The boy nodded, and Emily closed her eyes and focused inward for a moment. She twisted something for which Emily did not have the words to accurately describe, but could sense nonetheless, and opened her eyes. The water was glowing, but the crystal ball showed only mist. She could feel Leonard's awe and anxiety as she waited for one of Lord Edithrion's courtiers to answer. To her surprise, when the image formed, it was Lord Edithrion himself. He nodded briefly at Emily, winking at an angle that Leonard couldn't see, mischief sparkling in his eyes. Emily felt relief flood over her, although she was careful not to give any visual indication.
So, young Leonard, you have sought the aid of the Lamanti in finding us. Quite a remarkable effort, considering we do not exist. Perhaps you should return to your gears and flying contraptions.
Leonard, clearly remembering what Madame Ziralova, Emily, had said about treating this man as nobility, bowed low, going to one knee and keeping his eyes downcast. Please, your lordship, forgive my unintended insult to you and your people. It was spoken out of ignorance, not malice. Lord Idarithion raised an eyebrow.
I shall consider it, while we discuss the return of your sister to the mortal world. I presume that is what you have contacted me seeking?
Leonard glanced at Emily. At her nod, he returned his focus to Lord Iridithion's image. It is, your lordship. I humbly request that, as the error was mine, any punishment falls on me, not Abigail. Lord Iridithion smirked.
I rather think that is what is already occurring, don't you? After all, Abigail is now a treasured ward of my court, and is among those who value her and her gifts. You, on the other hand, are racked with guilt, and without your sister.
Emily could feel Leonard's shock at Lord Idarithion's response, and she felt him struggling to see things from Lord Idarithion's point of view. He recovered his composure quickly enough, however. Your lordship, I do not dispute that I am suffering from Abigail's absence, but I'm not the only one paying the price. My parents are grief-stricken and guilt-ridden as well. As it stands, the situation's hardly fair to them. Lord Idarithion's expression grew colder.
Ah. I suppose you refer to the father who barely acknowledges Abigail's existence except to criticize her flights of fancy. Or perhaps you mean Abigail's mother, who sent her out to play in the park alone so that she may meet with her lover in private.
Leonard's eyes went wide, shocked and confusion evident.
Lord Iderithion's eyebrow once again went up. Oh my! You were unaware of your mother's infidelity? Your sister was fully aware of it, I assure you.
He paused.
Your sister is sensitive in more ways than one, and having to keep such a secret was harming her. Not quite as much, of course, as your father's constant criticism of her insight into other worlds and her creative nature.
Leonard looked to be on the verge of tears.
Please, sir, we didn't mean to hurt her.
Lord Idarithion said nothing, instead turning to Emily. As soon as his face was no longer visible to Leonard, the mischievous sparkle returned to his coldness was gone.
Madam Ziralova, I assume you have informed the boy that the return of his sister will not come without a cost.
Emily raised her own eyebrow, letting Lord Iridithion know that she had caught on to his game, but keeping her expression stern so as not to alert Leonard. He has been informed, Lord Iridithion, and is prepared to pay any price that is within his power, as long as it does not harm anyone but himself. She phrased Leonard's earlier statement a little bit differently than he had, having a bit more experience in dealing with the Lords of Fairy and their ability to twist the words of a promise into something entirely different than what the one promising it had meant. Lord Idarithion grinned for a moment, then put on a stern expression as he turned back to face Leonard.
It will be a high cost. Your sister is gifted not only with the ability to see and sense other realms, but with the ability to tell tales that move the heart and mind of the listener. Such a child is a prize, worth far more than her weight in gold.
Leonard whispered his reply.
Your lordship, I'm prepared to pay whatever cost you deem appropriate, provided it is within my power and harms none other than me. However, your words have made me realize that returning may not be in Abigail's best interest. If that's truly the case, then I will offer to pay the same price for your oath that you will personally look after her well-being, both physical and emotional, until she is of age when she will be allowed to choose the course of her own life.
Emily could feel the sorrow and love rolling off him as he spoke, his determination growing with each word. Lord Idarithion's facade was abandoned as a joyful grin broke out across his face, and Emily somehow knew that while Leonard's declaration was not exactly what he had expected, Lord Idarithion was not entirely surprised by it either.
Oh, child, you show my court you are worthy of the honor I had intended to offer you in the park, and I will instead present to you as a potential payment.
Leonard's expression was confused, but Emily, in a sudden burst of clarity, understood some of what was going on. In the past, mortals, usually artists, tale spinners, and musicians, but sometimes knights and warriors as well, had been admitted to the fairy courts in the service of a lord or lady of the Fae. Emily had a feeling that some permutation of the old tradition was going to come into play. Lord Idarithion continued speaking as Emily pondered. My price is this. You will swear an oath of fealty to me, entering into my service. Every night, you will train with my master of arms and knights. Do not worry about how you will sneak away from your parents' house. A gate will be set in the door to your sister's nursery, and you will be taught to activate it. At Leonard's shocked and confused look, Lord Idarithion clarified.
A gate is a magical doorway between realms. When inactive, it's simply a doorway. You will bring your sister with you, and she will be taught the use of her gifts. You will both be taught the social graces befitting those of my service. I will expect you to watch over your sister and guard her to the best of your ability while she is in the mortal world.
He paused, giving Leonard a warning look.
This is not an excuse to slack off on your schoolwork. You will attend school as you normally would, and I expect you to keep up your grades. An alternative guardian will watch over her while you are at school. This arrangement will last until your sister reaches her majority. At that time, we will discuss whether you will to remain in my service and under what terms.
Emily watched and felt the play of emotions as they crossed Leonard's face. The boy nodded, then verbalized his acceptance of the Fairy Lord's offer as Emily's vision faded to black. She found herself back in the fortune-teller's tent, looking at the symbol-filled cards, symbols she understood, but could not explain. Madame Zerolova was watching her closely, and as Emily met her eyes, smirked a little. Emily was starting to find her amusement irritating, and she wondered if Madame Zerolova had created the visions Emily was experiencing, or if it was something about the cards that was causing them. She should be questioning the veracity of these visions, but her instincts were telling her that they were true memories of events that actually happened. Emily wondered if she'd lost her mind, and if everything she saw was simply her own imagination. She wanted to pretend that none of it was real, and hoping that when she woke up in the morning she would think it was just a dream. Madame Zerolova was watching her and found herself remembering her earlier words, reminding her that she was free to leave whenever she wanted to. Emily knew that leaving was probably the wiser choice. She also had a strong sense that if she left before the final card was flipped, she would never see Madame Zerolova again, and would never fully gain the rest of the clan's trust. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath and letting it out slowly before opening her eyes and flipping the other card on the side of the white pillar. As her vision blurred, but before it went completely black, she was absolutely certain that she saw a third person in the tent with her. Thank you. Her vision was only occluded for a brief second. She once again found herself in another's memory. She was sitting in the same tent that she had left, but she was on the other side of the table. It appeared to be around midday. The tent door swung open, and she saw Miss Calisand, wearing a dress with only 2 or 3 ink stains. She hesitated in the doorway, then made up her mind and entered with a determined look.
The gentleman running the apothecary said you might be able to help.
Emily found herself asking, "What do you seek?" Miss Calisand answered,
My grandmother is dying, but she won't spend the money to go to someone other than the local doctor, someone who might be able to remove the tumor, or have treatments that will help her fight, perhaps prolonging her life. I'm looking for something that will help her, if not get better, then at least slow the progression and ease her pain.
Emily frowned thoughtfully. Death is a natural part of life. Are you sure she isn't refusing to get better treatments because she knows it is her time and is ready to move on to the next part of her soul's journey? Miss Calisand shook her head.
I don't think so. She thinks I don't know how hard she scrimps and saves and works to have things to sell, so that she will be able to provide money for books and clothing for me, since my scholarship doesn't cover that, only tuition and room and board. It's my fault she won't get the help she needs.
Emily could feel Miss Calisand's grief and guilt. How is her decision your fault?
I could have gone to a less prestigious school, one that didn't cost so much, or I could have gotten a job to offset the cost of things the scholarship doesn't cover. I should have noticed something was wrong sooner and left the school so that she didn't feel she had to provide for me.
Mrs. Calisand was starting to cry.
At least then, I would have been here to support her, to have her understand how much I love her. Mother and Father didn't get along with her very well. I wanted to know that while I appreciate the money she sends, I value her presence far more than money.
Emily could barely sort out all the emotions Miss Calisand was radiating. There was despair and guilt, but under that, when she spoke of her grandmother, there was a deep love. She spoke, trying to clarify the emotions into something she could use. What are you prepared to give up to heal her? Miss Calisand looked up at her.
I'm willing to drop out of school and try to find a husband that my parents will approve of. I'd take the tumor myself if it were possible, and if it could be done without her knowing.
Emily frowned. That isn't the kind of bargain I make. However, I may be able to create an elixir that will work better than the ones your doctor has been able to give her with your cooperation. For it to work, you need to let go of your feelings of guilt and sorrow and focus on your love for her and the reasons for it. Do you think you can do that? Miss Calisand looked at her with tears of relief.
I think I can. The only way to find out is to try.
Emily nodded, pressed the button under the table. A child entered the tent, one Emily recognized from the gathering of Lamonti that she had seen before entering Madame Zurilova's tent. Elon, please fetch a vial for me, one of the larger ones, if there are any. The boy scampered off, out of the tent. Emily then told Miss Calisand to close her eyes and focus on her memories of her grandmother. She asked leading questions, asking her to describe her earliest memory of her favorite memory, and so on. Elon returned with the vial she had asked for, which was the same size and shape as the one Emily had seen Mrs. Calisand take medicine from, although it was missing many of the etched symbols. Thank you, Elon. He gave a small bow and left the tent. You may open your eyes now, Miss Calisand. Keep those memories foremost in your mind and think of your desire to heal her. Then give me your hand. Miss Calisand did as she requested. At this point, Emily could feel the love and hope that was pouring off Miss Calisand, her grief and guilt subsumed by the no longer deeply buried emotions. Emily took Miss Calisand's hand with one of hers and held the vial in the other. She began pulling, gently, from Miss Calisand's love for her grandmother and her desire to see her healed. Emily wondered if she should be concerned about diminishing the strength of the emotion by using it in this fashion. She realized she was somewhat separated from Madame Zurilova, allowing her to think for herself about what was happening. Madame Zurilova seemed to sense her, because when the bottle of medicine was full, she told Miss Calisand, "Love is the only emotion that has infinite energy. The more you give, the more there is to be given." She handed the bottle to Miss Calisand. "Take that to your grandmother. Tell her she should take a teaspoon of it once in the morning and once in the afternoon until the bottle is empty." She paused. "I would also suggest that you don't drop out of school right now. From what you have said, she's extremely proud of you, so she would feel guilt about putting you in that position. If you want to make her happy, send letters a little more frequently and listen to her stories with an open heart. Sometimes they contain more truth than any textbook." At those words, Emily once again found herself back at the fortune teller's tent, staring at a card filled with symbols. Madame Zurilova smiled at her from across the table. "Only one more to turn over before we see if you are ready." Emily looked confused. "Ready?" Madame Zurilova smiled and raised an eyebrow. "To flip the last card, or perhaps first, as it was the first one you tried." Emily nodded, then took a deep breath and let it out slowly before turning the other card that was closest to the darker pillar over. Once again, she was on the opposite side of the table, seeing and feeling what she believed must be Madame Zurilova's perceptions. It was no longer startling to find herself there. In fact, she'd been expecting it when she flipped the card. What shocked her was the person sitting on the other side of the table. A fairly young man sat across from Madame Zurilova, and if Emily was not mistaken, he was a younger version of Emily's father. He was dressed in a Lamonti fashion, and she now knew that the pin on his lapel was more than just an emblem. It was a symbol of rank. This young man was next in line to become the leader of the Lamonti. When he spoke, it was almost startling because they had sat there staring at each other for a good quarter of an hour before the young man gave in and spoke first. "You know why I'm here?" Madame Zurilova tipped her head to one side. "Do I? For that matter, do you?" He rolled his eyes. "I'm not good at the things I would need to effectively lead the clan. Normally, that would be settled when I married. My wife would take over. However, the woman I love is not of the Lamonti and would want nothing to do with me if she knew I was. I'm here to remove myself from the succession." Madame Zirlova frowned. "You do know what that means, don't you? The price you will pay if you are determined to go through with this." The man nodded solemnly. "I do." Madame Zirlova frowned. "You do realize you are your mother's only child and her only living blood relative. If you leave, the clan will be without leadership. Have you considered staying a month or two longer so that someone with the necessary gifts could be found?" He raised an eyebrow. "I informed my mother a year ago that I intended to leave. Her refusal to believe me is hardly my fault. If someone hasn't been found by now, it's unlikely any bound in the next few months." Emily could feel the grim resolve and determination, and knew he would not be moved from the stance he'd taken. Madame Zirlova sighed. "It is your choice, of course. Be aware, however, that doing as you wish will cost you the gifts of insight and magic. You will lose the ability to give emotions a physical form. This process will weaken you, and I will no longer be able to protect you, so you will be particularly vulnerable to illness. There will be no way to reverse this once it is done, so you must be absolutely certain that this is what you want." She paused for a moment, although she clearly intended to say something more. Emily's father interrupted her. "I know all this. My mother's been telling me this over and over again for the past year. I've made my decision, and you aren't going to be able to change my mind." Madame Zirlova fought the urge to roll her eyes. "There is a fact that I haven't shared with your mother yet. Any children you might have will inherit the gifts you have forsaken, and once they manifest, you may not be there to guide them in their use. They will have a choice, not long after they come of age, whether they wish to acknowledge the truth or bury their head in the sand to avoid any knowledge that society does not approve of." The young man, who Emily was increasingly sure was actually her father, nodded. "They must make their own choice, just as I have made mine. I will not keep them in the dark once they are grown." Madame Zirlova nodded and brought out a bottle. "And I will hold that which you are giving up in trust, until a child of your line chooses a different path than your own." She put a hand on her forehead, and the bottle filled. The liquid inside was clear, but shone with a light of its own, and had an iridescent quality that sent flashes of different colors of lights to the walls of the tent. When she was done, she corked the bottle, tossed it up in the air, snapping her fingers before it hit the ground, causing it to disappear in midair. "Live well, and I hope you do not come to regret your choice." Emily's father gave a slight bow, pin no longer on his jacket. "Farewell." Emily's vision faded to black, and then she was back in the fortune-teller's tent. Although she was beginning to seriously doubt that the woman, who appeared to be just a little older than Emily, yet had a look in her eyes that spoke of great age, was actually something more than a human fortune-teller. Emily realized that if the man in the last vision had been her father, then she was the child they were talking about regaining the gifts her father had given up. She wished her father were here now so she could ask him questions and find out if this was real, but he'd passed away shortly after her 16th birthday, having caught a cough that just wouldn't go away in spite of the doctor's best efforts. She wasn't sure what was supposed to happen now, while at the same time, she had a strong gut feeling as to where this was going. Emily looked at the first card she had flipped. It was no longer completely blank. It held the symbols that were the same on every bottle she had seen both in real life and in visions before they were filled. The ink was swirling around him as if it wanted to form more symbols but didn't know which ones to produce. She looked at Madame Zirlova. "First of all, was that man my father?" Madame Zirlova shrugged and replied, "What do you think?" Emily didn't even pause before answering. "I'm fairly certain it was him." "Then I would say you have a choice to make. Take up the gifts that were stripped from him, and with them the responsibilities of a priestess, and take your rightful place as the hidden leader of your clan. or choose to disbelieve what you have seen. Return to your safe life as a scholarly researcher and forget this ever happened. Madame Zerlova stated the choices with a bored tone, not putting emotional emphasis on either choice. Emily looked thoughtful. I suppose that the only way I'll find out how this all works is to take back what my father left behind. But I don't have the knowledge of how things work in their clan, the cultural context and understanding that are needed to be a good leader. Madame Zerlova gave off a soft smile. There will be people willing and able to help you learn, should you choose that path. Although the only way to truly learn how to lead is the experience of leading. Emily frowned, then nodded. I see. I don't think I can justify not pursuing the course, wherever it might lead. Madame Zerlova's smile grew exponentially. She brought out the bottle that Emily had seen in the last vision. Take this carefully. 1 dose now, and then a tablespoon in the morning, and 1 at night until you have taken it all. The changes in your perception need to happen gradually, or they may overwhelm and damage your mind. As soon as Emily took the bottle, Madame Zerlova disappeared in a swirl of multicolored sparkles. Emily started somewhat in shock, then looked at the bottle. She took the first sip, then put the cork back into the neck of the bottle. She got up to exit the tent. She became aware of an increase in sound outside the tent. She noticed her father's pin now rested upon her lapel. She hesitated, worried about the reaction of the rest of the clan. She heard a voice whisper in her ear. Don't worry so much. Your family simply wishes to greet you. Your grandmother is especially eager. She felt a gentle shove towards the exit. Emily took a deep breath, stepped out of the tent, starting a new journey, one that she was quite sure would never be boring.